What if instead of hard coding the relationships between your objects and tightly coupling them, you could instead inject them into one another? What if you could hand over the responsibility of creating objects and creating the relationships between them over to a framework to do that for you? My name is Terrance with Java Code Geeks, and today we're going to talk about dependency injection, an awesome tool for you to write cleaner, more efficient code. All right, guys, now before we get started, if you look down in the description, you'll see all the related articles and content from the Java Code Geeks website, where you can stay up to date with everything Java related. Now, if you guys are enjoying this content, please smush that like button and hit that subscribe button. That way you can stay up to date with everything that we have coming out here. With that being said, let's get started. All right, guys, so here we are. We're going to take a look at our PowerPoint example of dependency injection. So we're going to look at a couple key definitions and points of dependency injection. Okay, so first, what is dependency injection? Now, it's most simply defined as the way we go about getting an object that another object depends on to it, right? So we want dependency injection comes with this idea of having an object that relies on another object, and we want to make sure we inject that object into that other object. So we went through and broke down a couple of key definitions for dependency injection. So a dependency is something that depends on something else, right? In this case, we have a class, right, that's going to be able to construct an object that depends on another object. So we're injecting that class, that object depends on into it, right? Nothing more, nothing less. We're just trying to get this object an object that it depends on. And injection, the act of injecting, right? And you're going to see here in these code examples when we pull up our IDE how this is very much so like injecting something, right? Just like how you would get an IV at a hospital or something. We're literally just placing this into the object very specifically, very concisely, right? So now we're going to look at why to use the dependency injection, right? So why are we going to use dependency injection? Now this comes down to inversion of control and loose coupling, right? So with inversion of control, we're basically saying, hey, framework, I need you to focus on creating these objects and maintaining them and creating associations between them so I can focus on my code and I can focus on writing clean, efficient code. Right, so we're basically delegating this out to the framework in an amazing way. If you haven't seen this before, we're going to see this in a couple code examples where the framework actually abstracts the process of accessing the different methods or other properties from another object that's being used for the purpose of our project. Now, when it comes to loose coupling, we want objects that are not tightly coupled. And what that means is if an object breaks or something happens, that we can easily swap this object out, right? We're not completely, so say for example, if you had a certain database that one object was utilizing and something bad happens with this database, we can swap this out easily without having to go line by line and refactor all of our code, right? So we're going to make sure this is loosely coupled. We can swap it out very easily, and we can make sure that it's more easily tested also, right? Because we don't have this big this cluster of objects that are being tested together. We can break them down and figure out which one, we can write tests to make sure that each one is functioning as intended, right? So when we look at the disadvantages of the dependency injection, when we look at these disadvantages, basically what we're looking at is potential decreased readability. And what we mean by that is if somebody hasn't seen this before, or if you're just, you might be tired and you're just reading through this code and you haven't seen this before, and you might say, whoa, where did this object come from? Or, hey, how did you access this here? There's a certain learning curve when compared to hard coding everything that you're going to have to overcome to be able to see this here. Now, in addition to this, you're connected with the framework now. So rather than being tightly coupled with another object, now you're actually connected to the framework, and it's going to take you through all of its ups and downs, hopefully more ups and downs. As we mentioned, there's pros and cons to literally everything that you'll encounter when coding. But we're going to be able to see here the advantages and disadvantages of dependency injection, and this is one of them here, that you're linked to this framework. You're going to have to rely on this somewhat to get the job done. What are the types of dependency injection? So as we're going to see later in our code example, you have constructor injection, setter injection, and field injection, right? So we're going to use the fields of the class for field injection. We're going to use the setter method for a spring bean, right, for the setter injection way of dependency injection. And we also have constructor injection when a class of constructor is called, and then we have an argument that actually is the injected dependency. It's the actual object that we're injecting into it, right, in the constructor. These are all abstractions through the framework. So if you haven't seen this before, we're going to see this in a couple code examples coming up here. When to use constructor injection. This is information that's actually from the Spring documentation. So you always want to address the documentation whenever you're approaching technology that or even if you are familiar with it, you want to approach the documentation. So this is coming from their recommendations of how to use their technology, the Spring framework, which is the open source framework. And it basically says you want to use it when you have obligatory dependencies. And all that means is that when this object is constructed, it absolutely needs to have this dependency. It absolutely needs to have that other object. So we're going to use constructor injection to make sure it has it no matter what. Now, you want to use this when your goal is permanency, right? You're not going to try and change this later on. You know for sure to carry out this certain function that it's always going to need this other object. There's no other way it can happen. Next, we're going to look at setter injection. According to the documentation, you should use this when you have replaceable dependencies. So like we said, you're going to use dependency injection, and you could say, like we mentioned earlier, you can have a database that might be corrupt, and you have a certain bean that's utilizing that database. Now we can just swap out that bean, right? We can use dependency injection, swap out that injection, and instead of having to go through the more difficult hard-coded route, we know we know exactly what we need to change. We know exactly what we need to inject newly, right, into our application. Next, we're going to look at field injection. Now, this field injection, as we're going to see here, is very quick, very easy to write to make sure we get access to that object and its that dependency for our object, for our class there. But the Spring documentation does not, it frowns on it somewhat, simply because of Java reflections making it more difficult on your program, right? So if you want to look more into that, you can. As you're going to see here in a moment, we're going to see this field injection, how clean cut and concise it is. But the Spring documentation does say, hey, there's some disadvantages that you want to take into account in the way that it's going to affect your program later on through that Java reflections that it's going to utilize. All right, guys, and so with that being said, we're going to see this in a couple of actual code examples. And with that, we'll just go ahead and get started there. All right, guys, so here we are, ready to take a look at our dependency injection example. We're going to look at a hard-coded example. We're going to look at some field, constructor, and setter injection, right? So we're going to look at the dependency injection examples here. And we want to keep this idea of dependency injection very simple. All we're trying to do is make sure that an object gets the other objects that it depends on, right? Its dependencies, and it's able to use those for the needs of the application. And the dependency injection comes with these two key points that we covered in the slides that we just went through. And we want to make sure that we keep this in our sight, that we want to make sure that we have objects that are loosely coupled in case we need to test those and in case we need to swap them out if we have to change those for the needs of our application. And we want to make sure that we're using this inversion of control so that we can focus on the logic and writing clean, efficient code. And we can say, hey, Spring Container, hey, I want you to take over the process of creating these beans, creating these objects, and I want you to take over the process of connecting these beans together and wiring them together so you can control these interactions, so I can focus on the writing concise and clean code for my project. So now when we look at this here, we want to make sure we take first a look at the hard-coded example. So this is what we don't want. This is what we're trying to avoid with dependency injection. This is hard-coded. This is instantiated in here, and no matter what, these are going to be linked together here. And this might not be as detrimental in this particular dog sounds example, but in a larger application where you have this object that needs to be easily changed, you can't do that. You have this object that's hard-coded in here, and anywhere else that you're going to instantiate it, it's going to be hard-coded there also. Now, before we look at these dependency injection examples through the framework, we're going to look at this here. We're going to look at this Spring Boot application annotation and the component annotations that are being used between the two classes we have here. Now, so this basically tells the Spring Boot application that it's going to seek through there. It's going to seek out these at component annotations so it can use it for your application, and it knows where to look for these. So the Spring Boot application enables auto configuration and enables the Spring Boot application, and it also enables component scan so that it can scan for these components in your application. Now, when it finds them, it wants to look for this at auto wired annotation. And what that tells it is, hey, I want you to wire these beans together. Now, this is as opposed to using an XML file. We could go off and use an XML file to configure this, but I figure this is the best way. I believe this is the best way according to the documentation, the most up-to-date way to write clean, efficient code. So now when we look at this field injection, we're going to take a look at this example of field injection here. So why is it called field injection? Well, this is an actual field. We have this object here that we're going to be wiring through the use of a field, right? In this case, it's the golden retriever class's field. It's coming from over here though, but it's being stored in this object reference of noise. Now we can see down here when we utilize this that we're going to have access to this method for the purpose of this golden retriever class. So now if it needs a howl, right, we just want to make sure an object gets the object that it depends on, its dependencies, so it can carry out its need for the application. So now it has access to this howl method simply because we were able to use field injection and inject this method into this other object, or inject this object into this other object. So it has access to those methods from that object, right? So now what we're going to look at here is setter injection. And we've all seen setters before. I'm sure if you're looking at dependency injection, you've seen a setter, right? We have our getters and setters. Now this is a setter method that's being used to set this dependency here. This dependency up here, and it's using this abstraction once again with the at auto wired annotation there so that the Spring Boot application can scan for it, and it can wire these beans together so it can have the access to this object here. Now, once again, this is hard coded up here. We have access to those methods, yes, but this is going to be harder to test, right? And if something breaks here, these are going to be tightly coupled, right? Those are going to be, this is hard coded there. So with the setter injection, what we have here is loose coupling. We're just injecting this here, this dog sound object, and we're able to access those methods all the same, right? It's more efficient, it's cleaner. Now, we want to look at the constructor injection. So we just looked at a hard-coded example. We just looked at field injection, and now we're going to look at constructor injection. So when it comes to constructor injection here, we can see that this golden retriever object here is going to be constructed with this dog sounds object. And we're instantiating this here. We're using the framework to instantiate this for us. So once again, we have access to this method. And as we mentioned before in the slides, is that constructor injection, you want to use this whenever you have an obligatory need. You have a need between these two objects where this object absolutely has to have this other object. It can't have it any other way, which is why it's going to be constructed with it, right? So we're using a constructor injection through this at auto wired annotation there. All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed that content today. If you did, please remember to smush that like button and hit that subscribe notification bell. That way you can stay up to date with everything we have coming out here. Bye.